Welcome to another episode of Energy Perspectives and our podcast. We are recording today at Stanford, at our Stanford Energy Leader Series. I'm Monika Simoes. I'm the CEO and founder of Energy Dialogues, and I'm here today with Phil Moeller, Executive Vice President, Business Operations Group and Regulatory Affairs at EEI, and former FERC Commissioner as well, and also Norris Wright, VP of Gas, LNG, Low Carbon Origination at Constellation. Thank you both for being here with me. Our topic today is the interplay and interdependency of the gas and electric systems, and we've been talking about that pretty much the entire morning already. It's a big topic, and we will fit as much as we can in the next 20 to 30 minutes. I'd like to start us off with just a couple of framing comments. So obviously what we want to do here is talk a little bit about where we are now. What is it that we see that is very different from how we've seen it in the past? And then talking a little bit about how are we dealing with it, what is next, and then looking forward, how can we move and progress forward, what's going on. And before I turn it over to you for some introductions, just a couple of thoughts. You know, we were talking about it earlier. There is load growth projections that are unprecedented. I think, Phil, you'll talk a little bit about for how long, but about 50 to 60 years that we've seen anything similar. And the flavor of the day, or rather the big topic that comes up everywhere these days, is on AI, data centers, and just the incredible growth in power demand there as well, driven by the hyperscalers. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on. As we start talking about that, maybe as a little bit of introduction from both of you, what is your current role? How are you looking at some of these challenges currently? And what is kind of your assessment of where we are today? Philip, I'll start with you.
Very good. Well, Monika, thank you for having us here on this podcast as part of this Energy Dialogues as well, because it's been a very productive day so far. I should note that the Edison Electric Institute is a trade association of electric utilities, electric companies. Many of our members also own gas, local distribution companies, but not all of them. So we're kind of right in the middle of that mix, and I'll go into some more details about the situation we're facing in a moment.
Great, thank you. Norris?
Yeah, again, thank you as well for having us, and another fantastic event, I think. Constellation comes at this from the perspective of a power producer, as well as an energy customer business, both power and gas. And I happen to be on the gas side of the business now, though spent many years on the power side, and certainly have really seen the interdependence of gas and power come to the forefront in a way it hasn't over maybe the past decade or two since I've been in the industry.
Thank you for that. And so let's dive right into it. You know, what are you seeing as some of the things that have never been in this way before, and what are some of the challenges that we're facing, and how did we get here?
Well, we've had a period of roughly 15 to 20 years where demand for electricity in this country has been basically flat. There have been some blips here and there, but there are a variety of reasons for that. Some of it was economic slowdown, some of it was energy efficiency, but now we're facing a very different situation that we probably as a nation haven't faced since the late 60s, early 70s, where we're looking at projected load growth of percentages that have been, again, not in most of our career timelines, of some areas 6, 7, 8, 9% over the next few years. Not all of it's actually here yet, but the projections, as you noted, from data centers, the hyperscalers, the extra demand from AI, which takes more electricity to answer a question than typically another internet search. Chips factories, batteries factories, electrification of the economy more generally. And so that has policymakers, regulators, and industry people really in a unique position because it's a great opportunity, but it's full of many profound challenges.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, adding to that, I think during that time of really flat load growth, from a commodity markets perspective, we saw very little volatility, which is, I think, the condition of a well-supplied or low growth market. And we've really, I think, seen market prices react to where the grid is now, which is we've had a couple tests of grid resiliency. We've been okay in some places, just barely. We've failed in some places. Winter Storm Uri is a good example of that. And it's those things that have brought tremendous volatility into markets that for, again, it was a decade of very low volatility. And it's highlighting this need for new infrastructure to respond not just to the demand, but the way that energy gets used on a timely basis. And so from our perspective in terms of delivering energy to customers and the cost to do that, I mean, the signal is being sent.
So there are a lot of convergence, right? Policy, technology, infrastructure, a lot of things that need to be done to kind of transition a little bit from the old systems to the new systems. You said opportunities, you mentioned customers. What are some of the key things to look at right now? And maybe I'll bring in the recent FERC transmission rule there as well. What do you think is the impact going to be potentially, and how should we look at all of these challenges? I liked how you said opportunities, because let's not just talk about the challenges. What do we have to do? And I'll ask about customers later as well a little more, but.
You want me to start out with that?
Sure.
All right. Well, the commission, the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where I served earlier in my career, recently put out a major order. It's almost 1,400 pages long. A final rule.
Reading material?
Yes, exactly. That attempts to set a set of policies forward where we can get added transmission built in this country. And one of the more unique aspects of it is it requires transmission planners to plan on a longer time horizon instead of 5 years, but try and project 20 years out and use a series of factors that have to be analyzed that range from extreme weather to new technologies. But all of these factors have to be analyzed as part of a longer range plan. And I think most of the industry is very supportive of that, because thinking out farther is something that has been a key component of some earlier successful big transmission projects, I think particularly those in the Midwest part of the country, but that started a little over 10 years ago. So that part of it is good, but none of these rules that come out of FERC are an instant solution. It will take probably at least a year to finalize the rule as it goes through different iterations. There could be some litigation. The compliance period of actually coming up with these plans is going to take some time. So it's a very positive step in terms of developing transmission assets. And transmission will be a big part of our future, but it doesn't substitute for more generation. It can move generation resources, regardless of the fuel source, to where it's consumed, the load, but transmission is not a substitute. And in the short term, we're really going to need to be focused on getting more generation in the ground so that customers can benefit from it if we're, as we expect, to see these major new additions of load growth.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the differences, I think, between the power and the gas market in terms of this infrastructure build out, which is there is the opportunity actually to build new generation closer to load zones, whereas in gas, they're really you're going to find the gas where the gas is, and then you're going to need to move it. But I mean, to me, this transmission policy from FERC really just it's highlighting again the need to create more pathways, build new infrastructure that's really needed to meet this load growth. Over the past several years, I think the real sort of go forward or mode of operation has been Band-Aid fixes more. And now this is a nod to say, I think we've reached the extent to which we can put Band-Aids on a system that was built decades and decades ago, really. And we need new configuration. We need to rethink as we move forward and really engage with this massive growth in demand.
And of course, so there's policy building all this new infrastructure, right? What will it take? I know that one of the conversation topics was how energy policy is now being seen as a reliability risk. Some thoughts on policy, maybe broader. Also, you mentioned generation that we should be really paying attention to.
Yes, what complicates this issue for our members is that some of them are allowed to own generation, and in some of the markets they're not allowed to own generation, and yet they all have this fundamental premise that goes throughout our industry regardless of business structure, which is an obligation to serve. And that's fundamental to the utility industry generally, but particularly with the electric company industry. And so you've got the obligation to serve, but in some cases not the ability to build the generation. That's where in some cases our friends at Constellation will come in depending on the market structure and others, but they do have a different business model. And so again, that's part of what complicates the set of solutions to get more generation built. The wholesale markets have to be giving the right price signals to invest in this type of generation or even other types, any type of generation. And then again, we need the transmission infrastructure to move it to the customers who will consume it. And then on the gas side, we have to make sure that there is sufficient pipeline capacity, particularly to feed the generation units that burn natural gas.
Yeah, and energy policy covers so many things. Reliability is the one that comes, I think, front of mind when you talk about energy policy. But we're seeing energy policy cover decarbonization so much more now. And so you're adding a second layer into what is being mandated, how we're designing markets, what is infrastructure being built for. And so, I would say the pipelines are the pathway, but the demand for the storage of energy really, I think, is far more this is a function of this kind of new grid, this new demand coupled with decarbonization, and that storage is really needed to be backing up these non-dispatchable resources that have really been built out tremendously over the past 10 years.
It's part of the reliability of the system to have the storage, whatever form it takes, gas storage, water storage, to help meet those peak times when energy is particularly expensive and particularly valuable, particularly in terms of, in the cold weather, health and safety, but hot weather too. And the reliability, the sustainability, our industry is getting cleaner, but we always have to keep affordability in mind too, because there are major efforts to make sure that people can afford the energy that they need.
So a couple of follow-up questions on that. We're talking reliability a lot, and we have to talk about natural gas when we talk about reliability and affordability, while we're also trying to decarbonize the sector. So that importance of natural gas continuing to be part of this, no matter how much we are electrifying everything. Any thoughts on that, and how, maybe also how to communicate around that?
Yeah, well, that is, excuse me, that is the challenge when you're looking at a lot of climate targets that seemed far away when we set them, but are now suddenly becoming really a reality, and we're having to hit the glide path on how do we actually achieve these. In many ways, natural gas has been a great decarbonizer because you've switched off of more emitting fuel sources over many years, but now it comes as the primary hydrocarbon in the energy fuel mix. And so when you're having increasing demand for electricity, you naturally should expect to see an increasing demand for natural gas. But that shouldn't stop us from looking at other technologies. And in fact, my company is, I think, very vocal about being supportive of technology agnostic policy that rewards decarbonization efforts, both from a customer standpoint as well as from a production standpoint.
I think it's important to point out that our sector is significantly below 2005 levels in terms of carbon, significantly. And our nation is actually leading the world in terms of reducing carbon. And our sector is the leading sector in reducing that. It's easy to forget that. A lot of that is due to the conversion of using more natural gas instead of coal. And yet, we are still going to be using a lot of natural gas going far into the future. The Electric Power Research Institute, which is headquartered over on Sand Hill Road, although most of their operations, I think, now are out of Charlotte, is an entity that is purely about research and information. They don't lobby, they're not into public policy, but they're some of the world's best researchers in these areas, and they're predicting that we will actually be using the same amount of gas in 2050 as we're using now. Now, we'll be using it differently, probably more for peaking to help when the intermittent generation and renewable generation needs to be sustained, because, of course, the sun does eventually set and the wind doesn't always blow. And yet, as we talked about earlier, this electricity system is ultimately governed by the laws of physics versus any other laws. And so having a reliable, stable system where the system stays at 60 hertz so that it doesn't collapse is essential to our economy and to people's health and safety and well-being.
And I think it's very important to emphasize that just because there is more gas, it doesn't mean more emissions, right? And we can actually decarbonize by using gas. And as we started out on the data centers and AI, and I was wondering whether the entire conversation would kind of go there because that's how it feels it goes these days. But of course, I mean, one of the things I recently heard was how because of all this anticipated demand around data centers, there are coal plants that are not being retired. And so I think in this all of the above and what are the different energy resource mixes that we're looking at, it's important to look at what is the ultimate outcome as well. Coming back to the customer piece, you were, and we said this earlier as well, obviously there's a cost in electrifying everything, right? And making sure there are no blackouts and people don't end up without energy. So there's an incremental cost, and someone was mentioning it this morning, how the customer needs to hear that, right? And we don't always talk about it maybe enough. Any advice, any thoughts from your experiences of how do we do that better? How do we create more dialogue? How do we engage customers into that conversation as well so that they have a choice to really understand what they're getting or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges we have in the energy industry is these things are complex. And so when you talk about the cost and you try and explain what is costly, well, building storage is costly, and that's really, it's an insurance policy on grid reliability. People, I think, a lot of times think of cost from a commodity perspective and not the whole delivery mechanism. And so the additional costs, things like balancing the grid, and that has changed so much with non-dispatchable resources, right? Like we've gone from a very dispatchable grid to one that is taking wind and solar as it comes on the grid, and there's a real cost, particularly to utilities, as I'm sure your members would highlight, particularly to them in terms of response time, having assets available when they need them, and that's a big cost. So it's hard to explain the electric bill because it contains a whole lot of different parts, and the gas bill not as much, but a lot of different parts of that cost.
Yes, it's something that I think about occasionally. So I grew up on a ranch, so I know a lot about agriculture. and there used to be a lot higher percentage of the population that lived on the land and understood the trade-offs.
Yeah.
Now we're much more efficient, but people have not much of an idea of what goes into producing the food that we consume. I think the energy industry is very similar. We've done so well, and I mean we very collectively as a society over decades and decades, so that people pretty much count on energy being there, particularly electricity, and they're surprised when it's not. But there are people in control rooms every minute of every hour of every year that are there all night long, making sure that this system stays stable. There are people who go out after a storm to restore power. There's so much more to it that is kind of out of sight and out of mind. So it is difficult to explain it, because I think we've done a really good job collectively delivering power really quite affordably. If you look at the price of electricity compared to inflation for most of the last 50 years, it's been under that. And so that's what we call the energy wallet. What are people paying for all of their energy? Not just electricity, but gasoline, other fuels that they may use to heat. And there are some studies, EPRI has one of them, that as we electrify more of the economy, not the entire economy, there always will be a place for gas, but as we electrify more of the economy, particularly on the transportation side, the average household, I believe, will save about $1,000 a year going forward. But that concept of an energy wallet, it's hard to get it to resonate with people, because it's a different way of thinking of things. If we go forward as we believe we will, the time frames can be challenged. You won't be going to a gasoline station as much, but your electricity bill would be higher. But overall, the amount you spend on energy would be lower. So again, it is very difficult to explain, but there's a lot of reason for optimism.
That's good. I like.
And I would say we do spend a lot of time with our customers, mostly our C&I type customers, but we spend a lot of time with them on their energy procurement, and why things cost what they do, how the trade-offs they're making and the ways that they procure the energy, like what those cost them. And there's a trade-off again in reliability versus, you can have firm service versus an interruptible service. We are giving them lots of choices, lots of ways they can help themselves reduce their bills. And on their utility side, the more we see the rollout of sort of time of use and smart meters, those types of things, I think also help put in people's hands the tools to help themselves save and probably understand the grid a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because you do need the smart meters, and they're not ubiquitous. They're in many places, but not everywhere. But those allow customers to have more of a decision as to when they consume power, because there's a big disconnect between the cost of power at the wholesale level and what people are charged at the retail level. And I think very generally there's a growing consensus that we need to have those price signals at the retail level better reflect what the value of it is at that time period at the wholesale level, so that people ideally will use less power when we're at peak and it's the most expensive, and the reliability is more critical, and then shift as much of that power demand into the trough periods, like the middle of the night when the wind is blowing. And so we can send more power through the system using the same amount of infrastructure, but we can't expect customers to be altruistic. We need to send them proper price signals so that they can react accordingly.
I think my takeaway here is that, for one, the more energy rich a country is, the more complex the systems and the harder to understand. And so making sure that there is that understanding and the information, it's really important, but it's a complicated job as well to do that. Wasn't the topic of the conversation, but I liked how we brought in the efficiency piece, right? Because efficiency is so important and probably doesn't get enough attention as well, but it's going to make a big difference.
Absolutely.
As we are wrapping up, what would you say, looking forward, what are some of the key components for success, if we want to make it, as I always say, how can we provide more energy with less emissions? And that's really the challenge and the opportunity of our times.
Yeah, I mean, I like the phrase the energy trilemma, because it's renewable energy, affordability, and reliability. So how do we make all three intersect? Man, is that a hard equation to solve. But I think first off, back to the policy issue that we started with, which is we need to have good, stable policy that incentivizes not winners, but incentivizes a collective end goal, and allows all technologies to compete to get there and be fairly rewarded for that. So, and I think we have good starts for that in different parts of the country, both at the federal and the state levels. We have some also examples of where that hasn't worked out so great. But learn from those lessons and keep moving forward with the good policy incentives to get us there.
I want to build on that a bit, because the electric industry is the most capital intensive industry in our nation. And these decisions about putting in pipes and wires and new generation, those facilities will last decades. And so you want to make sure that you have a stable investment environment, hopefully as stable in terms of the policies as possible, so that taking that uncertainty out adds to the certainty of the investment climate. And so that is vitally important. We have to maintain reliability, number one. If we lose reliability, and there are examples where that has happened, you kind of pay for it in the public sphere, but you can also have to deal with public policies that are very difficult or punitive to deal with. So maintaining reliability, we're on this great projection of a cleaner, more resilient system, but it's not going to be linear. There are going to be things that come up, like all of a sudden, 2 years ago, we weren't talking about this gigantic demand that's now hitting us, whether it's AI, data centers, electrification. So we have to be flexible enough to know, again, that it won't be linear. It might sometimes take a little more time to get there, but if we do the reliably, along with a conscious effort on affordability, we've got a bright future ahead of us.
Well, that's a great way to end it. Someone was saying this morning that doing this is a moonshot mission, right, to reliably decarbonize the electricity sector. But we're making great progress, and I think there are things that need to be done, but also we're doing a lot of things, right? So thank you both for what you are doing in your organizations, and thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks,
Monika, thank you.
Yep.